scared. Get hold of yourself, he snapped. You know your job. There's a story to write. The life of David Ingersoll. That has to go down smooth. His dark eyes shifted to his hands and back sharply to Shandor. A propagandist has to write it, Tommy. An ace propagandist. You're the only one I know that could do the job. Not me, said Shandor flatly, standing up. Count me out. I'm through with this, as of now. Get yourself some other whipping boy. Ingersoll was one man people could trust. And he was one man I could never face. I'm not good enough for him to spit on, and I'm not going to sell him down the river now that he's dead. With a little sigh, John Hart reached into his desk. That's very odd, he said softly, because Ingersoll left a message for you. Shandor snapped about, eyes wide. Message? The chubby man handed him a small envelope. Apparently he wrote that a long time ago. Told his daughter to send it to Public Information Board immediately in the event of his death. Read it. Shandor unfolded the thin paper and blinking unbelievingly. In the event of my death during the next few months, a certain amount of biographical writing will be inevitable. It is my express wish that this writing, in whatever form it may take, be done by Mr. Thomas L. Shandor, staff writer of the Federal Public Information Board. I believe that man alone is qualified to handle this assignment. Signed, David P. Ingersoll, Secretary of State, United States of America, 4 June 1981. Shandor read the message a second time, then folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. His forehead creased. I suppose you want the story to be big, he said dully. Hart's eyes gleamed a moment of triumph. As big as you can make it, he said eagerly. Don't spare time or effort, Tommy. You'll be relieved of all assignments until you have it done, if you'll take it. Oh, yes, said Shandor softly. I'll take it. He landed the small PIB copter on an airstrip in the outskirts of Georgetown, haggled with security officials for a few moments, and grabbed an old weather-beaten cab, giving the address of the Ingersoll estate as he settled back in the cushions. A small radio was set inside the door. He snapped it on, fiddled with the dial until he found a PIB news report. And as he listened he felt his heart sink lower and lower, and the old familiar feeling of dirtiness swept over him, the feeling of being a part of an enormous, overpowering scheme of corruption and degradation. The Berlin Conference was reaching a common meeting ground, the report said, with Russian, Chinese, and American officials making the first real progress in the week of talks. Hope rising for an early armistice on the Indian front. Suddenly he hunched forward, blinking in surprise as the announcer continued the broadcast. The Secretary of State, David Ingersoll, was stricken with a slight head cold this evening on the eve of his departure for the Berlin Conference, and was advised to postpone the trip temporarily. John Harris Darby, first Undersecretary, was dispatched in his place. Mr. Ingersoll expressed confidence that Mr. Darby would be able to handle the talks as well as himself, in view of the optimistic trend in Berlin last night. Shandor snapped the radio off viciously, a roar of disgust rising in his throat, cut off just in time. Lies, lies, lies. Some people knew they were lies. What could they really think? People like David Ingersoll's wife. Carefully he reined in his thoughts, channeled them. He had called the Ingersoll home the night before, announcing his arrival this morning. The taxi ground up the gravel driveway, stopped before an army jeep at the iron-grilled gateway. A security officer flipped a cigarette into the ground, shaking his head. "Can't go in. Secretary's orders." Shandor stepped from the cab, briefcase under his arm. He showed his card, scowled when the officer continued shaking his head. "Orders say nobody." "Look, blockhead," Shandor grated. "If you want to hang up by your toes, I can put through a special check line to Washington to confirm my appointment here. I'll also recommend you for the salt mines." The officer growled, "Wise guy," and shuffled into the guard shack. Minutes later he appeared again, jerked his thumb toward the estate. "Take off," he said. "See that you check here at the gate before you leave." He was admitted to the huge house by a stone-faced butler, who led him through a maze of corridors into a huge dining room. Morning sunlight gleamed through the glassed-in wall, and Shandor stopped at the door, almost speechless. He knew he'd seen the girl somewhere. At one of the Washington parties, or in the newspapers. Her face was unmistakable. It was the sort of face that a man never forgets once he glimpses it. Thin, puckish, with wide-set gray eyes that seemed both somber and secretly amused. A full, sensitive mouth, and blond hair exceedingly fine, cropped close about the ears. She was eating her breakfast, a rolled-up newspaper beside her plate, and as she looked up her eyes were not warm. She just stared at Shandor angrily for a moment, then set down her coffee cup and threw the paper to the floor with a slam. "You're Shandor, I suppose." Shandor looked at the paper, then back at her. "Yes, I'm Tom Shandor, but you're not Mrs. Ingersoll." "A profound observation. Mother isn't interested in seeing anyone this morning, particularly you." She motioned to a chair. "You can talk to me if you want to." Shandor sat down in the proffered seat, struggling to readjust his thinking. "Well," he said finally, I wasn't expecting you." He broke into a grin. "But I should think you could help. You know what I am trying to do, I mean about your father. I want to write a story, and the logical place to start would be with his family." The girl blinked wide eyes innocently. "Why don't you start with the newspaper files?" she asked, her voice silky. "You'd find all sorts of information about Daddy there, pages and pages." "No, no, I don't want that kind of information. You're his daughter, Miss Ingersoll. You could tell me about him as a man. Something about his personal life, what sort of man he was." She shrugged indifferently, buttered a piece of toast, as Shandor felt most acutely the pangs of his own missed breakfast. "He got up at 7 every morning," she said. "He brushed his teeth and ate breakfast. At 9 o'clock the State Department called for him." Shandor shook his head unhappily. "No, no, that's not what I mean." "Then perhaps you'd tell me precisely what you do mean." Her voice was clipped and hard. Shandor sighed in exasperation. "The personal angle, his likes and dislikes, how he came to formulate his views, his relationship with his wife, with you." "He was a kind and loving father," she said, her voice mocking. "He loved to read. He loved music. Oh, yes, put that down. He was a great lover of music. His wife was the apple of his eye, and he tried, for all the duties of his position, to provide us with a happy home life." "Miss Ingersoll." She stopped in mid-sentence, her gray eyes veiled, and shook her head slightly. "That's not what you want to hear either?" Shandor stood up and walked to a window, looking out over the wide veranda. Carefully he snubbed his cigarette in an ash tray, then turned sharply to the girl. "Look, if you want to play games, I can play games too. Either you're going to help me or you're not. It's up to you. But you forget one thing. I'm a propagandist. I might say I'm an expert propagandist. I can tell a true story from a false one. You won't get anywhere lying to me, or evading me, and if you choose to try, we can call it off right now. You know exactly the type of information I need from you. Your father was a great man, and he rates a fair shake in the write-ups. I'm asking you to help me." Her lips formed a sneer. "And you're going to give him a fair shake, I'm supposed to believe." She pointed to the newspaper. "With garbage like that? Head cold?" Her face flushed and she turned her back angrily. "I know your writing, Mr. Shandor. I've been exposed to it for years. You've never written an honest, true story in your life, but you always want the truth to start with, don't you? I'm going to give you the truth and let you do what you want with it. Is that the idea? No dice, Mr. Shandor. And you even have the gall to brag about it." Shandor flushed angrily. "You're not being fair. The story is going to press straight and true, every word of it. This is one story that won't be altered." And then she was laughing, choking, holding her sides, as the tears streamed down her cheeks. Shandor watched her, reddening, anger growing up to choke him. "I'm not joking," he snapped. "I'm breaking with the routine, do you understand? I'm through with the lies now. I'm writing this one straight." She wiped her eyes and looked at him, bitter lines under her smile. "You couldn't do it," she said, still laughing. "You're a fool to think so. You could write it, and you'd be out of a job so fast you wouldn't even know what hit you. But you'd never get it into print, and you know it. You'd never even get the story to the inside offices." Shandor stared at her. "That's what you think," he said slowly. "This story will get to the press if it kills me." The girl looked up at him, eyes wide, incredulous. "You mean that, don't you?" "I never meant anything more in my life." She looked at him wonderingly, motioned him to the table, a faraway look in her eyes. "Have some coffee," she said, and then turned to him, her eyes wide with excitement. The sneer was gone from her face, the coldness and hostility, and her eyes were pleading. "If there were some way to do it, if you really meant what you said, if you'd really do it, give people a true story." Shandor's voice was low. "I told you I'm sick of this mill. There's something wrong with this country, something wrong with the world. There's a rottenness in it, and your father was fighting to cut out the rottenness. This story is going to be straight, and it's going to be printed if I get shot for treason. And it could split things wide open at the seams." She sat down at the table, her lower lip trembled, and her voice was tense with excitement. "Let's get out of here," she said. "Let's go someplace where we can talk." They found a quiet place off the business section in Washington, one of the newer places with the small enclosed booths, catering to people weary of eavesdropping and overheard conversations. Shandor ordered beers, then lit a smoke and leaned back facing Anne Ingersoll. It occurred to him that she was exceptionally lovely, but he was almost frightened by the look on her face, the suppressed excitement, the cold, bitter lines about her mouth. Incongruously the thought crossed his mind that he'd hate to have this woman against him. She looked as though she would be capable of more than he'd care to tangle with. For all her lovely face there was an edge of thin ice to her smile, a razor-sharp, dangerous quality that made him curiously uncomfortable. But now she was nervous, withdrawing a cigarette from his pack with trembling fingers, fumbling with his lighter until he struck a match for her. "Now," he said, "why the secrecy?" She glanced at the closed door to the booth. "Mother would kill me if she knew I was helping you. She hates you, and she hates the Public Information Board. I think Dad hated you too." Shandor took the folded letter from his pocket. "Then what do you think of this?" he asked softly. "Doesn't this strike you a little odd?" She read Ingersoll's letter carefully, then looked up at Tom, her eyes wide with surprise. "So this is what that note was. This doesn't wash, Tom." "You're telling me it doesn't wash. Nice wording. I believe that man alone is qualified to handle this assignment. Why me? And of all things, why me alone? He knew my job, and he fought me and the PIB every step of his career. Why a note like this?" She looked up at him. "Do you have any idea?" "Sure, I've got an idea. A crazy one, but an idea. I don't think he wanted me because of the writing. I think he wanted me because I'm a propagandist." She scowled. "It still doesn't wash. There are lots of propagandists, and why would he want a propagandist?" Shandor's eyes narrowed. "Let's let it ride for a moment. How about his files?" "In his office in the State Department." "He didn't keep anything personal at home?" Her eyes grew wide. "Oh no, he wouldn't have dared. Not the sort of work he was doing." With his files locked under key and the key in the State